be with us today. So we're recording. Just a quick reminding that all recordings can be found on the Wellness Hub on Inside Carilion. So at this time, I would like to introduce you to Teron Watkins, and I hope I'm saying your name correctly. Teron is the programs manager for the Virginia chapter of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, where he works to expand suicide prevention education, strengthen community partnerships, and connect individuals with resources that promote hope, healing, and mental well-being. So let's give a nice big warm round of applause for Taryn. And Taryn, thank you so much for being with us today. I know I reached out to you quite a while ago, and you were eager and anxious to answer the call and be willing to come and present to us today. So thank you so much. And I'm going to stop sharing my slides now and turn it over to Taryn. Taryn's having some issues accessing camera. That's all right. We can be patient.
All right, there we go. Sorry about that. I was just
No
waiting for a little
problem.
bit of access here. And lastly, may I also be given access to share my screen, please?
Let's see. All right, you should have that since you're a presenter. Are you not able to share?
Let's see. No, my apologies. My share button looks to be blanked out, and it says only meeting organizers and presenters can share.
Okay. If anybody on this call has any ideas of how I can do this, I am not seeing that option here when I click on. Teron, did I say your name correctly?
Yes, you did. Yes, you did. Thank you so much,
Yay!
Julie. Thank you for
Great,
that, by the way.
great. Um,
My apologies, everybody, for this delay.
this is on me also. So thank you all for being patient here. Um,
Let's see here.
right.
There we go. Thank you guys so much. All right. Sorry about that. Give me a half a second here, and I will get us started. All right. And are you all able to see the screen? Yep. There we go. All right, I'll get started in a second. Julie, can you just confirm that it is showing my PowerPoint?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you all. And thank you everybody for sitting with me through that. Sorry about that. So I'd like to start with the introduction. My name is Teron Watkins. I am the programs manager for AFSP, also the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. My pronouns are he and him. And today we're going to be discussing the sensitive topic of suicide, which happens to be a subject that happens to be sensitive, but we're looking to break the connotation and the stigma around it. So I'm going to go forward and give you guys just a little more of an introduction to suicide prevention, as well as some of the other risk factors that might be included in this topic as well. So before we begin, is please let me I'm pleased to share with you guys that AFSP is actually a informational and educational and this is actually used for educational purposes only. This is not to take place as the replacement of a mental health provider. However, just more information for you guys to move forward with as well. So this program was developed by the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, or AFSP, and our mission is actually to save lives and bring hope to those affected by suicide. And so we actually do that through 5 different core strategies, which happen to be outreach and support, research, education, public awareness, as well as advocacy. And we actually do that by supporting the scientific research around the suicide prevention, as well as educating the public about mental health, suicide prevention, as well as suicide loss. Also, while also advocating for public policies to support mental health and mental health prevention. An example of that is actually just came back from our National Advocacy Day in Washington, D.C., in which we were advocating for 3 bills to actually help around suicide prevention as well. So just like your physical health, we all have mental health, and mental health actually includes our emotional, psychological, as well as social well-being. The brain plays a big role in our mental health as well as the other factors. So if you guys have an opportunity, please write down in the chat what mental health means to you, and we'll just make note of that and keep that in mind as we're moving forward throughout this program as well. So research actually shows that most people who die by suicide have a mental health condition at the time of the death. It may not have been recognized by the person or by their loved ones, or it may not have been adequately treated. However, we have found that 90% of people who do die by suicide do have a mental health condition at the time of their death. With that being said, research has also made it clear that mental health conditions are not the whole story, just one part of the story. So 1 in 4 people will actually experience a mental health condition, and most go on to not die by suicide. So having a mental health condition does not automatically mean that it is a precursor to suicide. However, it is one of the things that we do pay attention to as we're keeping these factors in mind. So Talk Save Lives provides guidance to the community members on how to recognize warning signs, how to create a conversation about suicide, as well as connecting people to help. However, it is important to know that the robust public health strategy is also just as important in this as well. So we want to make sure that we are building a culture that addresses suicide prevention through our universal education and health promotion, as well as in healthcare, schools, and workplaces, while also making sure that we are changing the social and cultural norms to decrease the stigma and encourage help seeking around suicide prevention, as well as also continuing to make sure that we are going on to continue to talk about treatment as well as recovery. So we actually believe at AFSP that everybody has a role in reducing the risk of suicide. And so I hope that by the end of this presentation, everybody here will be able to describe the impact of suicide, identify contributing factors of suicide, as well as protective factors that can go into it as well. Also understanding how suicide may impact on certain communities differently than how it impacts other communities, as well as describing how to recognize the warning signs in suicide as well. And lastly, we also want to make sure that we are listing ways to seek and offer support and crisis resources for those who might be going through a moment of crisis. So this is actually one of my favorite slides, and it's one that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. It's actually thinking about the fact that how we talk about suicide matters. We oftentimes avoid the subject of suicide or suicide prevention because most people don't really know what is the right thing to say about it. So we want to avoid saying things like committed suicide or failed or successful suicide attempt. And we want to do that because saying committed suicide often puts a negative connotation on it. When we think of things being committed, we think of, somebody maybe committing a crime or, maybe committing a sin or things of that nature. So that's not something that we want to add to the stigma of suicide. And so we actually want to avoid saying things like committed suicide, as well as failed or successful attempt. Because what I always tell class is, what are we really judging that based off of? What is making it failed or successful attempt? Instead, we just say attempt on a suicide attempt or attempt to end their life. We don't gauge it based on positive or negative or successful failure. So instead, what we actually do say are things like somebody may have died by suicide, or the person may have ended their life, or the person may have made a suicide attempt, or the person might have had a death by suicide. So these are phrases that we use in replace of committed suicide and failed suicide attempt, failed a successful suicide attempt. as well as terms used to describe individuals who have lost someone or might be dealing with the suicide loss themselves are suicide loss survivors, as well as a survivor of suicide loss, or suicide bereaved as well, or a person bereaved by suicide. And also somebody who might have made an attempt in the past, we might also refer to that person as a suicide attempt survivor or somebody with lived experience. And so when suicide is talked about safely and accurately, we can help reduce the judgmental and stigma around it and encourage people at risk to actually seek the help that they might need in that moment. And so now we discussed a little about how we want to talk about it. I'd like to discuss the scope of the problem. So suicide is actually one of the leading causes of death in the United States. Each year, nearly 50,000 people die by suicide, with well over a million people making a suicide attempt, and even more than that having suicidal ideation. So this is something that we do want to pay attention to. And this problem is one that is growing, unfortunately, as well as the impact of suicide on on family members as well as friends and community is far reaching and even more and even longer than just the one person who might have taken their life. And so most people have been affected by suicide in some way. So what I've often tell people is, when I first started AFSP, I was nervous about doing these types of presentations because in my mind, I didn't have a direct connection to suicide or to suicide prevention. It wasn't until maybe about a month in that I realized that this is a topic that actually connects to everybody, and everybody has been affected by suicide in some gradual way or manner. And so that is something I also keep in mind, and I share with everybody else going forward. And so all populations are actually affected by suicide, but there are many factors that contribute to differences in suicide rates in different populations. These things include things like access to healthcare and support, as well as experience of marginalization, as well as access to lethal means such as firearms. While people at the population level of some communities experience negative conditions or factors that increase the risk of suicide, identifying as a part of one of these communities does not mean that you are inherently at a risk to die by suicide. So, just shown here, we have the few stats here that males are actually 3.5 times higher rates of suicide than in females, while also factoring in that middle and older adults have a higher age of suicide rate than younger people, as well as also making note that veterans have a higher rates of suicide than non-veterans. And then again, suicide rates are 3 times higher in homes that actually possess a firearm. So these are some of the things that we're actually going to keep in mind and discuss a little further as we go further here. Youth still has one of the lowest rates of compared to other age groups, but unfortunately, this is actually rising, and so that is something that we're looking to combat as well as suicide rates amongst Black and Asian American and Pacific Islanders youth is also raising as well. And unfortunately, there is lack of research around the um group of around this group. However, we have noticed that the attempts have gone up, and so that is something that we want to make note of as well. So, in the United States, most people who die by suicide are actually of the working age. And so we've actually done a little more research to break down what that actually looks like in a few occupational groups. So we have some of the groups listed here, mining, as well as gas extraction, construction. Construction suicide rates have actually risen so much that we've actually started an individual walk, actually titled Hike for Hope, that is centered around making sure that we are raising awareness for construction workers and suicide rates amongst construction workers, as well as a few different industries, as well as personal care, and service, installation, maintenance, and repair, and a few different working groups like that. So when somebody dies by suicide, people may usually see a life event or life stressor like losing a job or a breakup or bad grades and assume that that was the event that caused the suicide. However, we've actually found that that's not the case and that's not how suicide works. There's actually no clear cause, no single cause to suicide. Behind the scenes, there are multiple risk factors that are coming to converge together that actually lead to maybe the crisis moment and the moment of crisis that actually lead to a suicide attempt. So here in this display here, we've actually shown that it's not just the one current life stressor. It is a combination of biological factors, combined with psychological factors as well as social and environmental factors, combined with the current life stress and event, while also having access to lethal means that might actually lead to a suicide attempt. Now, this is just a little more in detailed, a little more in depth and detailed example of all those different factors and different things that actually could lead to a person being in a moment of crisis. So as you can see, we have some underlying biological, psychological, and social environmental factors such as substance use, mental health, trauma, social skills, abuse, neglect. Head trauma might also lead to this, as well as access to care and genetics. Or somebody, may have made a suicide attempt in the past. These are things that we also want to keep in mind and factor in as well. Now let's discuss some of the potential contributors to suicide risk and suicidal behavior in more detail. And these are some of those psychological as well as environmental and biological factors that can actually lead to a person making a suicide attempt. So again, if the person has previous suicidal behavior, these are things that we want to make note of and pay a little extra attention to. While it does not mean that the person will go on to die by suicide, and actually most people who do end up making an attempt go on to not die by suicide. Um, but these are factors that we do want to keep in place and keep in mind as well. Or if the person is discussing or expressing or experiencing different mental health conditions such as depression, bipolar disorder, or eating disorder and substance use, then these are factors that can also go into maybe heightening the person and sending them to a crisis moment as well as genetics. If you come from a family that has a history of suicidal ideation, and these are other factors that we want to make sure that we're keeping in as well and just making sure that we are paying attention to them, as well as the ongoing social factors such as rejection, victimization, race or gender discrimination, prejudice, as well as systematic racism and historical trauma also can lead to um, a feeling of combativeness and a feeling of suicidal ideation as well. So these are things that we also want to keep in mind as well. As well as a person who's had adverse childhood experiences, including growing up or witnessing experiences of violence, abuse, neglect, or maybe even a loss of a family member, can also lead to risk factors of higher suicide rates as well. So these are things that we want to factor in. Now, what I would like to say is that there's also hopeful news that there are some protective factors that can reduce a person's risk of suicide as well. And these actually include different skills such as his coping skills, the source of strength, as well as their resiliency. So we've actually found that, a lot of people actually find their sense of resiliency through their tie into their faith-based community, or maybe through a family mantra that they might have that they actually stick to as well as a person's willingness to participate in mental health as well as availability and access to mental health care plays a very important role into being a protective factor against suicide attempts as well. So if anybody can experience suicide risk, why do certain groups and populations have higher rates? So in the next few slides, we're actually going to discuss a few of those contributing factors that actually might lead to one group maybe having a higher rate over another, and kind of discussing ways that we can also keep in mind and also make sure that we are making sure that we are, excuse me, protecting and also making a community around these groups as well. So for individuals 65 or older, certain life circumstances may actually arise that bring up the risk of suicide. For example, older adult may actually live alone and might feel an increased sense of isolationism, which might actually often leads to a feeling of a constrictiveness or a feeling of a crisis thought that could lead to a suicidal attempt. As well as also changing their health can also lead to loss of independence. Uh, major roles, Major role changes such as retiring, as well as an adult. Maybe they are going from maybe taking care of themselves to maybe being in an assisted living home. These could also raise the risk of suicide as well. As well as people of older adults are also more likely to experience the loss as well, and so that might actually lead to more of a crisis moment for them as well. So we touched on it just briefly earlier, but also there's not too much research. We're still actually gathering research around suicide rates on the LGBTQ community and individuals of the community. What we have found is that they often do have face a social stigma and prejudice and being discriminated against on feeling a sense of marginalizationism, which actually lead to the feeling of isolationism in this group, which actually might actually lead to suicide attempts actually growing, unfortunately. And while suicide data amongst transgender community is also limited, one study has actually found that transgender individuals were almost 9 times more likely to make an attempt of suicide than the general population. And again, that's probably based upon that sense of marginalizationism and prejudice and not being accepted as well. As well as in addition to the protective factors, as we discussed earlier, social discussed earlier, such as social support and resiliency and connectedness, increasing acceptanceness and affirmation around the LGBTQ community can also go a long way into making sure that we do lower the suicide rates amongst this community as well. And so, for more than a decade, suicide rates have been higher and have risen faster amongst veterans than non-veterans. Unfortunately, the suicide rate for veterans is 1.5 times higher than the general population. And while veterans are often more vulnerable to the same, are often vulnerable to the same risk and precipitating factors of suicide that the general population have, they also face a few different um, risk factors as well, such as it's more, and you might be more inclined to actually find a veteran dealing with the issue of homelessness or also experiencing exposure to traumatic events, as well as also maybe dealing with the readjustment process of to civilian life, especially within the first 12 first was when excuse me within the first 12 months. And I spoke a little more about us actually going out and doing public advocacy. That was actually one of the bills that I actually went and spoke on earlier for the National Advocacy Day at Capitol Hill, was actually about making sure that we did have a process that allowed us to have more of a readjustment process for veterans as they're bringing back into civilian life as well. As well as among U.S. adults who have died by suicide, firearms are most commonly used amongst veteran deaths, and nearly 75% of veteran suicide deaths, unfortunately. So this is something that we do want to keep in mind, because veterans do tend to have more access to a firearm in the home as well. So these does bring up the risk factor as well. And now that we understand how the different groups are affected by suicide, we'll explore the experience of someone struggling with suicidal thoughts and behavior. I also want to make sure that we keep in mind that thoughts of suicide are complex and that each person has their own pathway to feeling suicidal or having or making a suicide attempt. And what we often will do want to make sure that we do lean into on this part of the presentation is that the person is actually dealing with two different things. So they are actually dealing with um a purpose and a desire to live. However, that is maybe just being blocked off or maybe not being able to be accessible because they're in a moment of crisis and kind of thinking in a constricted thinking. And so their thinking isn't really all the way open to that way they have those coping skills that they are normally able to possess. But it is important to notice that the person may who is dealing with thoughts of suicide may be feeling like a burden to those around them. Also, maybe feeling overwhelmed with hopelessness. That is a emotion that we actually see raise up a lot. Excuse me, as well as part of them may be experiencing a pain that they want to end while also having a deep desire to live, as we just spoke about. So when a person reaches a moment of crisis, as we just briefly said, their thinking comes very constricted, and they often causing them to think in a sense of a tunnel vision. It is very unfortunately, in a crisis moment, you are thinking like a horse in a race. So you only have the blinders on and you kind of only see one pathway. And so that is something that somebody who might be dealing with the crisis moment might be experiencing in the moment. As well as they cannot foresee a time which the unbearable pain is coming to an end, and that may actually cause them to focus on suicide as well as the as thinking of that's the only way to end that pain. And so it is often important to remember that the person is thinking in a constricted mindset and doesn't have access to those coping skills or even the problem solving skills that you might know the person to possess. They just don't have access to it in that moment. And they're also maybe experiencing an unbearable physical or emotional pain that feels inescapable. And so they're looking for a way to just kind of get out of that pain cycle. And so thoughts of suicide are often very temporary, and research actually has provided clear evidence that in a moment of crisis, it is important that we do provide time and distance. That can actually be life saving for the person in the moment of crisis. Time for the crisis moment to pass, and distance in between the person and the lethal means that they might be considering as well as also a little more distance and a little more time to actually give them access to mental health support and mental health care that they might be needing in that moment. So the good news is that there are 4 steps that we can actually take to make sure that we are helping save lives and to bring hope to those affected by suicide. And those 4 steps are actually making sure that we are watching out for the warning signs. So we're going to go a little more in detail into what that might look like, as well as reaching out for a conversation, keeping your environment safe, as well as connecting the person to help and other resources. So these are the 4 steps we're going to spend the next few moments breaking into here. So we want to make sure step one is actually watching out for the warning signs. And the way that we do that is we want to listen to how the person may be speaking. So a person may be saying things like, speaking of ending their life or having no reason to live, or they may speak about feeling being a burden or feeling trapped or unbearable pain. Or and you also want to pay attention to what the person's behavior might be. So if you're noticing that the person is, having an increased use of alcohol or drug use, or also, having issues with sleeping, or a major one that we've actually found is actually giving away prized possessions or giving away possessions that mean a lot to them. I'll show you guys a video later in which that'll kind of give an example of that, but that is something also a factor that we're going to keep in mind as well. As well as also looking out for their mood. So is the person in a depressed state? Are they feeling very apathetic? Are they also feeling very irritable? And the last one that I always want to make sure that I highlight is a sudden unexplained burst of happiness. We've often found that usually when that a sudden unexplained happiness comes, the person may have decided on the method that they would like to use. And so we want to make sure that we are having that conversation and keeping it open for that as well. And the second step is to always make sure that we are having the conversation. And there are 3 key things to do in order to have the conversation. I always tell people to trust your instinct. And so if you feel as though the person might be going through a crisis moment, or you might be noticing something different about somebody or a peer that you are really close to, it is trusting your instinct and knowing that, hey, it is all right to have that conversation with the person. While also assuming that you're going to be the only one to reach out. A lot of times what we actually find is people actually do go through the bystander effect of assuming that, oh, well, I shouldn't be reaching out or having this conversation because they have somebody who is closer to them that should be having this conversation with them. And so we often assume that the next person might have the conversation, thus leading to it never happening. And so we want to always want to assume that we're going to be the first person and the only person reaching out. And lastly, also being okay with the awkwardness. So again, asking about suicide can feel like a very awkward topic, and it can feel like something that is very again awkward, just for lack of a better word. But that is why we're tending to break the stigma and also make sure that we are talking about suicide prevention and also talking out of the darkness. And so being okay with that awkwardness as well. And so before you reach out to someone you're concerned about, it's important to keep a few things in mind. We want to make sure that we are avoiding minimizing their feelings, and we also don't want to get into a debate about life being worth living. As well as lastly, we want to make sure that we aren't offering fixed advice, Um, we it's so easy to get into a place of, somebody telling you something and you go, oh, well, why don't you just do this? Why don't you just do that? We want to make sure that we are doing active and empathetic listening and not looking to solve an issue, but looking to actually be present and listen to this person in the moment. And so on the screen here, we have just a little example of how that could look for you. And now that we have actually started the conversation, we want to make sure that we are listening with empathy. So we want to make sure that we're doing things like asking open-ended questions and listening to the person's response, as well as showing empathy and support, not only with our words, but with our body language as well. So we want to make sure that we are having an inviting stance and body language when we're doing it. We don't want to have a conversation about suicide and have our arms all folded up here and just think, oh, I hope that you don't really tell me anything. We want to make sure that we are being inviting. And lastly, when we're listening with empathy, we also want to make sure that we are listening for those warning signs that we just discussed. So as the person saying things like they are feeling like a burden or feeling overwhelmed, a sense of hopelessness, we want to make sure that we listen for those warning signs. And as well as we want to also, and as part of the second step of having the conversation is make sure that we do ask directly. And this is often very important. So while some people worry about asking if suicide might actually put the idea in the person's head, we've actually found that research shows that that is just flat out not the case, and that's not the way that it works. And that if you ask somebody about suicide directly, it does not put the thought in their mind, and that while the mind is a strong brain, was a strong muscle, so it is not that easily weak-willed. So if that were the case, I always tell people, I always make the joke, if it were just as simple as, whenever I have the conversation, then you might be putting the thought in your mind, then I would recommend everybody after this presentation to just go ahead and donate $20 to me personally, if it was just that simple. So what we've actually found is that, having a conversation about it and asking directly does not put the thought in their mind. However, we do want to make sure that we are asking the question directly, because when we say things like, yo, you're thinking of harming yourself or you're thinking of hurting yourself, the person is probably naturally going to say no, because whatever they're thinking of is a means to the end of the pain. And so they're not thinking of this is going to cause me pain or cause me harm. So instead, we want to make sure that we are asking very directly, are you thinking of ending your life? Or are you having thoughts of suicide? Or thank you for sharing that with me. Are you thinking of ending your life in this moment? And so having those conversations to keep it very open and direct can be the difference in making sure that we are going through a moment of crisis, as well as getting a person past that step. And if the person says no, they're not thinking about suicide, then that's a good thing. We want to be apathetic, or we want to be empathetic for that as well. And so we also want to make sure that, all right, well, they're not having thoughts of suicide, but we do want to say things like, I am sorry that you're hurting so much, and I do care about you, and I want you to be safe, and I want you to get the help that you might need. So we want to make sure that, all right, we're still listening empathetically, and we are still reaching out to give them the mental health professional help that they might need in that moment. Now, if somebody tells you that they are thinking about suicide, that can feel a little alarming, but it is important to remember to stay calm and just think about that these are just thoughts of suicide. The person is not in immediate danger in the moment. And so you also want to take time to calmly ask a few follow-up questions like, well, do you have a plan on ending your life? Or did you have a method? Or do you have that method available? So we're asking these questions because this is actually important to making sure that we are removing the person and creating that time and distance, as we spoke about earlier. So if the person does have a method in mind, we want to be able to remove that method from them and create that distance between the person and the lethal means method that they might have in mind as well. And so to close this conversation, I want to reiterate to you that we're glad to connect on a deeper level of about meaning and about the meaningfulness of things in life, and also to remind them that we all have challenges at times, and that you'll continue to be there for them. So you want to make sure that you are staying connected with the person, thanking them for sharing their story with you, because that is an incredibly challenging thing for them. So we do want to make sure that we are thanking them, as well as connecting them to whatever resources might be available for you in your area. Now, I do want to share with you guys a video here, just going over a few of the things that we discussed.
I'm not hearing audio.
Oh, my apologies. Thank you for that. Let's see here. Well, I can't seem to find the audio button, and also for sake of everybody's time, I'm just gonna go ahead and skip forward here, if that's all right with everyone. And so actually in the next few slides, we're going to explore the third step of suicide prevention, which is actually making sure that we do keep the environment safe. And so this allows time for the crisis to de-escalate, an opportunity for us to go ahead and step in and provide help. So whenever we refer to the phrase lethal means, it actually refers to a method that can be fatal if a person uses it in a suicide attempt. And limiting access to lethal means includes different things like securing and reducing access to those methods, especially in the home environment, and as well as can be a proven strategy to help in suicide prevention. So the way that we actually do that, and examples of that are if the person has a firearm in the home, maybe removing the firearm, including decorative firearms as well. That could be something as simple as unloading it, locking it, or disassembling it as well. Or, we've actually seen in a few occasions where the person might actually have the firearm stored in their home, but the ammunition actually stored in a completely separate location. As well as we also want to make sure that we are securing medical, over-the-counter medications, as well as different toxic substances that could also affect to it as well. Additionally, we want to make sure that the person feels included in this process as well. So as we're thinking about the lethal means, we can ask them, well, what do you need to feel safer in this environment or in the safest in this place as well? And we also encourage them to actually refrain from substance use throughout the crisis moment as well. And so again, a major part of keeping the environment safe is actually includes the storage of firearms. Um, Nearly half of all U.S. households have at least one firearm in the home, and that is if someone is at the risk of suicide, having a gun can actually be very fatal. And so we also want to make sure that we are in some states. We also want to make sure that we're aware that in some states firearms is used as many as 70% of the suicide rates. And as we said earlier, in the veteran community, there are actually 75% of suicides done by a firearm as well. So these are things that we do want to make sure that we are locking up and securing. And I have heard of in a few different counties, there actually being different processes, such as a give back your gun program and different things of that nature, in which you can even take it to a police station and they actually hold the gun for you until you feel like you're in a safe moment as well. I've also been to a few experiences or a few tabling events where they actually have gun safety block boxes that can actually be helpful as well. And so can actually be something that we should look into as well. And of course, the fourth and final step is actually to prevent suicide is connecting the person with resources. So this is actually one of my favorite slides as well. I always remind people to if you're ever in a crisis moment or you're dealing with somebody who might just need a little extra assistance or might be dealing with the crisis moment, please dial 988. That is our national number that's the National Suicide Prevention Hotline that was able to actually get formed there. So you can dial 988 and there will be somebody on the other line to chat with you there. You can also text 988 as well. They also have a text line there that is available for you, as well as I also tell people all the time too. If you have an iPhone, sorry, I always like to look down because whenever I do this example, it does trigger it. If you have an iPhone, if you were to talk to the person in the iPhone, named Siri, if you were to say, "Hey, I'm having thoughts of suicide," it actually will prompt the phone to actually call 988 for you and actually go through a crisis moment as well. So these are the tools that we also have available, as well as different things like the Trevor Project, that is still being worked on, as well as the as course of any emergencies, please dial 911. And lastly, we also want to make sure that we are connecting people who might be in a moment of crisis to professional care. And so a few of the national places where you can find actually that professional care are through findtreatment.samhsa.gov or through Mental Health America /finding help. You can also get that, as well as maybe also continuing treatment and following up regularly if you do take the person to a mental health professional and they do actually do evaluation there. And the last thing I always like to tell people is, make sure that you are practicing self-care and connecting with loved ones in your community as well. We've actually found that building a sense of community does lower the risk of suicide rates amongst most groups. So building that sense of community as well. And here are just a few other resources that are also available here. And again, I wanted to highlight first prioritizing self-care because again, that can actually show up through your mind, through your body, through your soul, or through your surroundings as well. So I would actually like to leave everybody with the open challenge of taking a few minutes to write down at least one self-care activity or category that you can actually lean into as you're going forward here. And there was another video, but since we don't have the sound actually working, and I also want to be respectful of everybody's time, I will also skip that as well. Oh.
Teron, we are just about at the very end of time. So I don't want our meeting to get cut off. People are putting some comments in the chat now. Thank you so much. That was wonderful information. I have included lots of links in the meeting chat for some well-being resources, especially concerning mental health, that Carilion offers to you. Somebody asked for some information about listening skills, empathetic listening skills, and Deborah Farron has graciously agreed to provide some of those. So I will share those with everybody who's on the call today. Thank you all for sharing. I know some of you shared some very sensitive and just heart-wrenching experiences that you've had. So I appreciate you being here. And I also want to share about that Carilion has a Center for Grief and Healing that one watcher today did mention, and that was very helpful for her. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Teron. Appreciate you spending your lunch with us and enlightening us and educating us. Did a wonderful job. Thank you all in the audience for supporting our mental health series for this entire month. Again, there are lots of resources listed on Inside Carilion. You can visit the Wellness Hub. You can also find a lot of those resources in your Personify Health app under benefits. I will be sharing your Personify Health voucher code within the week, so look for that. And again, just thank you all to everybody. Be sure, as Teron mentioned, just be aware. Take care of your own self. Make sure you're taking time to do those things for yourself. And don't be afraid to reach out if you need help or you know somebody else who needs help or suspect that somebody needs help. Have a wonderful afternoon, everybody. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you on June 16th for safety and security. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you, everyone.